Well, it's fallen to me to sum up 50 years of Dyfed Archaeological Trust in little over 30 minutes, which is not going to be easy, so I shall try. First of all, we used to do things differently almost 50 years ago, and we wouldn't do that now, I would say, straight off. We would do it, find different ways of doing that sort of work, but things were different. And it's also worth remembering just how things have progressed and changed over the almost 50 years. So one of our basic tools has always been the Historic Environment Record, the HER, or the SMR, which we call the Sites and Monuments Record. And this was set up, Don Benson, the first trust director, came from Oxfordshire, where he started to set up the Sites and Monuments Record there, came to Dyfed, and one of the first things he did was start to set up the record in Dyfed. This is one of the first ones in the UK, and so they're one of the first ones in the world, and Don was a leader in this particular field. And then it was obviously a paper-based record. We had forms. Each site had a single form and then a map, a paper map, which recorded a little dot on the map where we were. And that was it, really, backed up by lots and lots and lots of paperwork, as you see there. And Don was a pioneer in computerising sites and monuments records. And so the Dyfed HER, or SMR as it was one of the first ones, in fact was the first one in the UK to be computerised. And so again was the first one in the world to be computerised. Very basic computers, and in 1979 that computer cost £3,500. That excludes the screen and the keyboard. That's just the little box that goes with it. It's called a Research Machine 380Z. I'm not quite sure. I think the 380Z is just a random thing they just put on there.
It isn't actually. I worked on one in the
Okay, rightio. And if you often wondered where the term sort of clunky comes from, you would know if you worked on one of these, because every few minutes it would go clunk as the floppy disk span round. Now, all those records are just available on the Archaeological website. All the records, the whole of Wales, are there at a click of a button. We've just come so far, which was undreamed of in the paper record and dreamed of then as well. And right from the beginning, amazing discoveries are made. The first ever record on the SMR is this, number one. Is a hoard of Bronze Age gold bracelets found soon after the foundation of the Trust in a pipe trench being dug by workmen near Llandarlow. And just a few months ago, back in, was it February, I think we were there, this discovery was made. It reported this was seen in a very low quarry face in a bit of woodland, a modern quarry, just a scoop. It's a Bronze Age burial, as you see there. And amazingly, you could see the front, but when we actually took off what was in fact we thought was going to be a Bronze Age urn, which you see there in vertebral cremation, it is, but actually it's been dug out and a later one is put in on top of it in perfect condition, and that's had a cremation burial in it as well. So we still make these discoveries 50 years on, which are an amazing place to work on, which I think, who was there? Was it Jessica, you know, weren't you? It was quite remarkable just to find such an intact urn sitting there for 4,500 years. But some things stay the same. We still have to get out our drawing boards, our planning frames, and pencils. The techniques haven't changed in this case for probably over 100 years. And it's really still the only way to record things in detail. And I thought when I was trying to put this talk together, just how I do it, and I thought the only real way is to try and get some thematic highlights of the many, I think it's probably several thousand projects we've done over the past 50 years. So lots of things are going to be not even mentioned in this time. But one of the things that the project we first did, which was actually before I joined the Trust, was looking at standing stones, prehistoric standing stones. And again, this was Don's idea, that he recognised that we have lots and lots of standing stones in not just South Wales, but across Wales, across Western Britain. They were very poorly understood. No real excavation had taken place, and what had taken place was just a very small scale hole dug around the stone itself, and didn't find much, and that was it. So it wasn't until in the late 1970s that we went to Stackpole Warren, and there's a standing stone. And amazingly, when you actually excavate around it, you find it's set up of these thousands and thousands of tiny stones set up around that, sometime around about 1800 BC. So a standing stone is just one most visible aspect of what is a huge, huge site, and often perhaps not the most important bit of that site. In this case, to be able to excavate below it, the Panzer Division came in. Those who remember that the Panzer Division was based at Castle Martin tank firing range until the 1990s. And so they came in and moved the stone for us. We excavated below it, and there we found a stone was actually set up over a burnt-out timber roundhouse, which had human remains within it. Whether that's a deliberate act of burning down or was an accident is still debatable. But certainly that you're actually discovering a whole more load of things when you actually start to excavate on a big scale. And just keep an eye on that, which I'll mention later on. And a bit later on, in 1986, we excavated Plasgagurthan, another standing stone, a prehistoric site, again moved by a crane so we get excavate safely around it. And I'll say a bit more about this one later on. And it's really, I suppose, this theme of standing stones is probably a topic well worth revisiting now that it seems to have gone a bit quiet. Single standing stones are not very popular to be excavated around at the moment, so it's worth revisiting some of these sites and reinvestigating them, or investigating them for the first time. There, we've heard about Have West Friary, but way back in the late 1970s, early 80s, we're at the most beautiful building in Wales, which is not the ex-Tesco store. It's the Church of the Greyfriars in Carmarthen. And that car is probably sitting just about on the chancel of that church. It's a time when youth unemployment was really high, and we ran what we called manpower services schemes, job creation schemes, which allowed us to excavate on a scale not done since, really. We were there for, I think, 18 months, 2 years, continuously on that site. One of our sister trusts, the Glamorgan Gwent Trust, was the biggest MSc, Manpower Service Scheme, agency in Wales. I think they employed about 220 people at one time on those schemes. So again, excavated on a huge scale. Excavated the whole of the church. And interestingly, once on the dissolution of Henry VIII, the church building burnt down and some of the stained glass fell out. And that's being excavated, and then a restoration done of that particular window, which is the coat of arms of Rhys ap Thomas, who's the chap who was buried at Greyfriars, just about where that car is actually. Buried at Greyfriars. He was a person, reputed to have killed Richard III at Bosworth. And there's his coat of arms. And these early medieval cemeteries, again, have been quite a priority research for us. One of my first ever excavations of the Trust was on a small cemetery in Bayville in North Pembrokeshire. But it was really in 1986 when things started to get a bit more exciting, when you excavated on quite a large scale. And here this was by that standing stone I mentioned earlier. It was a multi-period site, and it had a small cemetery, early medieval cemetery around it, of one of which one of the graves had this timber building built around it, which that may be a reconstruction of what it may have looked like in about the 6th century or so. It's rather typical, the graves here, that on the very acid soils you get in in Wales is that a bone just doesn't survive normally, so you get empty graves. In this case, you can just about make out a stain of a coffin, which that burial would have been in, but no bones survived. And we looked at several more over the past few decades. This is a famous one here at Brownslade, Castle Martin tank firing range again. In this case, a well-known site, windblown sand, and because it's in windblown sand, the bone survives really, really well. But what happened here is you had these what we call long kiss graves. We've taken off the lintel stones which have been over that, but in fact what was happening is that badgers had got into this site, and those kiss graves made perfect little badger houses. So they're getting into those kiss graves and just clearing them out. The MOD made a little artificial badger set close by, persuaded the badgers to move out, and then we excavated the area affected by those badgers. And most of the graves were disturbed, but in that case, that's a perfectly preserved long kiss grave. I'll say a bit more about a couple of those later on. But again, as many of you in the audience here will recognise this site, which you worked upon as volunteers and staff, St Patrick's Chapel, again another early medieval cemetery, which that's the national parks, or the piece of law commissioned by the National Park to do a reconstruction of that site in its final stages. But what's really interesting is not just the cemetery itself with the huge numbers of burials we had there, but this little structure, which probably dates to about the year 750, which on one of the stones had this little inscription, Dunawec, a name, a boat and a wave. Dunawec is an Irish name, which is redundant by about the year 800. It probably means like noble youth, or it could mean the infant Don. Some debate about that. And you can speculate, is this the cenotaph? It's certainly not a grave. Is this a cenotaph of memorial of Donawec who was lost at sea? Is it Donawec founded this site, came from Ireland, this is his foundation, or is it just a simple piece of heritage crime where Donawec's bit of graffiti on this tomb, on this cenotaph or whatever? I know you can't see it at the back, but don't worry. This is what's possible to do now. And Franz mentioned about the isotopic analysis that was done being done at Haverfordwest. But it's really just opened our eyes just what you can find out about looking at these human remains, which was not even thought possible 40, 50 years ago. In this case, the 10 individuals looked at it at Brownslade, isotopic analysis, that only one was local to the area. It's right by the coast edge at Freshwater West in Pembrokeshire. Only one was from that local area. Some were from west coast of Ireland or west coast of Scotland, some from continental Europe, and some from the Mediterranean area, and one possibly from the eastern Mediterranean. So really quite eye-opener just how much mobility there was at that period. This is probably the 7th to 9th centuries. And one of them, this chap here, an older male, older than 45 years old, from the Mediterranean, also suffered from dish, which is a disease which I've never heard the name of. Bethan, what's dish? Tell me what it is. Idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis. Thank you. It's a disease caused by extremely rich diet, often lots of meat, dairy, and so forth, and probably an obese person. And as someone's pointed out, and so much for the Mediterranean diet. Nowadays we can look at DNA, and that's been looked at St Patrick's Chapel and Haverfordwest Friary, which you can get some family relationships going, but also perhaps looking at, again, wider population movements lots of other things. We look at, again, isotopic analysis, you can look at the diet of the people. And interestingly, at Brown Slade, the skeletal remains, they were quite clear that both male and female had really strong upper body strength. The muscle attachments are really, really big. And it suggested that actually they were perhaps engaged in rowing, sea rowing, or even beach netting for catching fish. But actually, when you looked at the diet, there's virtually no marine element to the diet whatsoever. So if they were out rowing on the sea, they weren't catching fish. Or if they were catching the fish, they weren't eating them. So very interesting sort of insights you get into the people of this period. Of course, scientific dating now is a given, and also what's coming now is looking at some more where ancient diseases, or where diseases come from, trying to trace back the disease into these ancient populations. And at St. Patrick's Chapel, I was speaking to Katie Haim of UCL, who's doing the work on the skeletal remains from St. Patrick's. There are lots of infants there, lots of very young children, and lots of them had lesions on the inside of their skulls, which I think could be meningitis. I'm not sure, but that's interested one of the professors in the medical school there, who's actually interested in see if we can actually trace back the pathogen that causes meningitis, its origins. So actually got his research, which could aid, help cures and prevention of those particular diseases. So there's a whole host of things you can do with human remains. There are huge numbers of round barrows in Western Britain and Wales, about 3,000 in total we know of, and there's probably lots more just out there waiting to be discovered. The little Bronze Age urn I showed earlier was in a round barrow, was unknown of. And now extraordinarily vulnerable. This one here was in danger of being quarried away. We did some work there way back in the 1990s, I think it was. It was covered in vegetation, and when we actually stripped the vegetation off, we ended up with that, thinking, how on earth do you excavate several hundred tons of stone from a round barrow in a couple of weeks? Fortunately for us, what the builders had done, actually, it wasn't a complete pile of stones. It was a rock outcrop, which actually encased in stone to make it look like an enormous great mound. And on top of it, there was a little Bronze Age burial. Unfortunately, it wasn't in particularly good condition. But to say this was in danger of being quarried away. This one here near Cardigan was in danger of just being erased in the landscape by agriculture. It's a site which, when he spoke to a landowner, said that the mound, when he bought the farm in the 1960s, was about 4 metres high. When we went there to the excavation, it was barely visible in the landscape. It was a really intense agricultural regime. And a couple more years later, it would have just gone altogether, just been taken away. But what was there was a central burial, which interestingly, like the urns I showed earlier, was the original burial had been replaced by a later one, which was this here. And this later one, which we thought, that's just a massive bone, we thought was a cremation burial, because cremations do survive. There's a chemical change takes place when bone is cremated, so it does actually survive in the soil better than just ordinary inhumations. But in fact, when it came to be looked at in the lab, it was a semi-articulated inhumation, and it had been someone who'd been probably semi-decomposed and chopped up and put in this grave, perhaps brought from somewhere else and replaced the earlier grave. And in it, and amongst that burial, were this jet bead necklace, almost certainly from Whitby area, Eastern England, a jet where it occurs. Which I'll say a bit more about in just a second, because the next one is a completely different landscape and a completely different threat to it. In this case, when this was done 2005 or 6, you wouldn't call it heritage crime then, but what was happening here is this highest point in Carmarthenshire. Is what was happening is that you can see the nice curbstones around what would have been the round barrow there, they're being ripped up by walkers to make a little walker's cairn on the centre, and they were being ripped up at an increasingly alarming rate. So he did some excavation, moved the cairn, did a bit of excavation, and there was below the cairn was a central kist burial, which had a huge capping stone over it. And I think at that stage we were discussing whether we should just leave that intact or whether we should actually excavate it. In the end, we decided to excavate it, and it was an intact Bronze Age burial with an urn, other objects, and a human cremation. We then backfilled the kist, put the capping stone back, and it was, thankfully it was the right decision to make. Because I went up there a few years later, the capstone had been completely moved away. It weighed about half a ton, and it been dug out. And the reason being is that I think it's a geocaching site. So people are going up there thinking they're going to find this little geocache and move that stone. Fortunately now the Murphy Archaeoleg National Park has now restored the site and put some more material over it to make it a bit more secure. So it's a bit more of a mound now and now grassed over. What's really interesting about Panther Butler and Van Voyle is when you look at the microscopic or the pollen through a microscope, you can obviously determine what the species are there, and there's a very high instance of meadowsweet. And it's been found elsewhere in the UK as well, that it does seem to have a particular resonance for burial rite 4,000 years ago. It was thought perhaps at some sites it was being meadowsweet rich honey was being poured into the grave. But in fact the pollen from both here, Van Voyle, and from Panther Butler was in little clusters. So it's quite clear it's flower heads. So what was being laid down was meadowsweet flowers in the bottom of this grave before the burial was put in the ground. And there's a really interesting little, can you see that at the back at all? Can you read that at all? It's a really interesting little the story of Blood Eyeworth. You can see it there anyway, the most beautiful and fairest maid ever seen. She was conjured up by magicians from the flowers of oak, the flowers of broom, and the flowers of meadowsweet. So a really interesting little story there. And interestingly, the Van Voyle, if you know where it is just above Musvai in Carmarthenshire, which has a connection with the medics of Musvai as well. So where there's actually you've got quite a long relationship going back with plants, meadowsweet and other plants. I'm not sure what our time's going.
You've got 10, 15 minutes?
Okay, that's great.
Oh, sorry, you've got 5 minutes. I'm so interested in what you're saying, Ken. That's the time to.
Okay. How long have I?
You've got 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay, split the difference. Okay, that's. We've always had a really good idea where the routes of Roman roads, essentially they're military constructions linking forts, but not actually that real coursum wasn't really known in many cases. So for instance, the road between Carmarthen Roman Fort and Llandudno Roman Fort, it said, well, obviously the A40 follows the Roman road because it's got nice long straight stretches along it, therefore that's the Roman road. But in fact that A40 was constructed by Thomas Telford in the early 19th century. And we now know actually through our photography that the Roman road, that basically Thomas Telford came to the same engineering solution as the Romans, but not quite the same. So the Roman road actually runs parallel or crosses or whatever the modern road. So we actually just got out to the moment from aerial photography, and here you see a really good example of that. This actually is the road from Llandudwy Fort up to Pimpsant. Llandudwy is there somewhere, there, and the fort's about there. And you can see the Roman road. And if you actually go there and look over the hedge, that road survives as an agger about 1 metre high still. It's really, really clear. And this is an excavation we did at Whitland Bypass in the 1990s. And there's the Roman road. Not much doubt about it there. Well preserved. Interestingly, it was built over a bit of a peaty area. And looking at the pollen from the peat, which Martin explained about what you can find from the pollen, immediately pre-Roman times, that environment was very much a pastoral environment, very little woodland, very little cereals, essentially an environment that is almost identical to today's in its broadest sense. And since the foundation of Trust, we found 2 Roman forts. Llandailo, which is in Dyfed Park, 2004, is always said for about 200 years that there must be a Roman fort somewhere around Llandailo in the Tawy Valley, midway between Carmarthen and Llandudwy. It's all been speculated where it is. 2004, the National Trust bought a bit more land to reunite Dyfed Park into what it had been, and there's a geophysical survey showing not 1 but 2 Roman forts, and that's just a reconstruction of what it may look like. And here's we did a bit of work, a bit of excavation just to confirm that. But essentially what you've got there are a fort for about 4,000 troops, constructed about 72, 73 AD. It's then the troops were withdrawn to deal with a rising in the north of the country. The fort was slighted. They came back about 10 years later. It's the same site and built a slightly smaller fort exactly in the same position. And the other one is at Wiston in Pembrokeshire, which again can change our view of what the Roman military did, simply because it was always said, if you read any textbook, up to fairly recently, it will say the Romans didn't militarily conquer Pembrokeshire or Western Wales because the tribes are friendly to them there was no need to. But now we know there's a Roman fort in the middle of Pembrokeshire, and there's probably more to be found. We've heard about Pendennis, so I'll skip over this a bit. And we've seen this map as well, these huge numbers of sites we have. But again, it's always something we've been interested in looking at. And what's we've really found, particularly in the 1980s, is that we really filled in the dots in this map. That we always known as sites like that as surviving as earthworks. But what really became obvious in the 1980s, Terry James, who used to work for the Trust through his area photography work in dry summers, found lots and lots more which are just not visible on the ground. There's no evidence whatsoever. You see them in dry summers every so often, perhaps even just for a few days they appear and then disappear as the rain comes or the field's harvested. So lots of these dots, particularly around there and there, of these type of sites. So really, really advance our knowledge of that period. And again, early 1980s, Manpower Services Commission schemes allowed us to excavate several of these on a really huge scale. I think that at Llywhaden in Pembrokeshire, several sites were done, and I think it's probably 2 years continuous excavation there, with about 30, 40 people. Vast excavations, not seen on that scale since. I always like to mention Portobello. It's such a spectacular site. One of Toby Drive's aerial photographs of excavating. It was a lot safer there on the ground than it looks on the aerial photograph. it looks a bit alarming there. And this is the excavation, the final season excavation. Amazing roundhouse, Roman period roundhouse. In that bit of the fort, the interior of the fort survives, is that little tiny bit, which is probably about a tenth of the original fort. The rest has just gone to the sea. And it won't be long before that disappears as well. And the post-excavation work is still continuing on this particular site. But what it's a building, but it's not a house as such, because it's not domestic. There's lots of tiny little hearths around, and I thought it was associated with ironworking, but the initial work that's been done indicates it's not ironworking. So you've got all these little tiny hearths which they're doing something with them, but it's still being investigated actually what that something is. But they certainly don't seem to be living in it, and are not producing iron or metal work, but they are doing something else which involves fires. I won't mention pendiness. And one of the other areas we've always been keen to investigate, which has always been really difficult to get a handle on, these Iron Age burials, this period from, well, probably about 1000 BC to the coming of the Romans, over 1,000 years. And in that time, we know all the hill forts and defending enclosure, we know exactly where people lived, but we don't really know where they were buried. And if you think of that period, there's perhaps, I don't know, several million people lived and died in Wales, and we probably have about 50 or 60 known burials. And so when we do find them, often by chance. So Stackpole, I mentioned earlier, that little circular pit contained a crouch burial, which is Iron Age in date. Next to it was a couple of infant burials. And then at Gogurthen, again, mentioned earlier, the standing stone, gas pipeline going in the ground there, and a ring ditch with an Iron Age burial in that as well, and a couple more Iron Age burials associated with that site. Interestingly, we've since that excavation was done, we've done a bit of work over there, road widening, and I think we're going to do soon a bit of work on that side of the road as well, as the road is widened there. But I suppose most spectacularly, Iron Age burial is the chariot burial we found in South Pembrokeshire a few years ago now, found by a metal detectorist who discovered a couple of these artefacts. There's some reproductions, I don't know if you've seen them on our desk in there, some that are there as reproductions. These are horse fittings, and bridle fittings and chariot fittings. We excavated the site. It's thought to be quite vulnerable to continuing metal detecting. Very acid soils meant that no bones survived, so the person who had been buried there just completely gone. But within the chariot, which had been buried complete, they dug a couple of deeper holes to drop the wheels in, but basically dug a grave, dropped the chariot in the grave. Whether the horses were with it or not, we don't know. But within the central area where the chariot would have been was a sword and other weaponry to go with it. And it all sat within a ring ditch. There had been a mound over the whole thing as well. And that just sits outside an Iron Age, big Iron Age fort, which still stands. The earthworks of that stand to 4 metres high. And that was previously unknown. Just no one had noticed it was there up to a few years ago. And one of the big pieces of work, or big parts of our work we've done over the years, are these what we call thematic surveys, which were funded by CADU. And really the sort of twin objectives. One was to enhance the HER, simply because at a lot of these sites we had records of them, but in fact And some of the records were 50, 60, 100 years old, and sometimes you had no idea whether these sites still existed or not. You know, we just didn't know. So we had to visit these sites, at the same time, and make recommendations to CADU to schedule the best examples of them. So again, there hadn't always been a sort of a systematic program of scheduling sites. Sian's in the audience here as an ex-inspector of CADU, and I think it was said by someone who could trace the bus routes out of Cardiff by the distribution of scheduled monuments. So with that, the recommendations actually that meant that the best examples of those sites are being scheduled and protected, given legal protection, and the whole range of different thematic sites that were done over perhaps 30 years or so. A really huge piece of work. The other thing I've always been keen to do, and we're always very proud, is actually to get our results out there to the wider audience, whether it's through specialist publications in journals or to more popular publications. But we always, that's something we always strive to do, and just get those out there. Some of those you've seen on our table outside, but this is a very small example of the type of things we've done over the past 50 years. Some very big pieces of work, some quite small pieces of work. Is that it? You can see the range of stuff we deal with, just everything basically. And again, the other thing we're always very keen to do is to engage with a wider audience, as wide an audience as possible. And today is one of these such things. But again, over the years, we've done all sorts of different events and activities. You should just see just a few examples there. And that's something we obviously will continue with into the future. And finally, many thanks to the people who have supported us financially over the years. Our biggest funder, single biggest funder has always been CADU, and they still are. And we're always really grateful for their support they give us. Lots of other people have supported us over the years. We had all the staff, huge numbers of work for us over the past 50 years. All the trustees have given their time, and also all the volunteers. Some of those in the audience today, just a few of us, but without you and all these people here, just all those projects just wouldn't have been possible. It wouldn't have happened. So thanks very much. Thank you.